to the deep dive. Our mission today is, well, it's arguably the most audacious one we've ever taken on.
I think that's fair to say.
We've been handed this stack of sources, really detailed, cross-textual analyses, and they claim to have discovered a single, profound, unifying theological structure, one that apparently underlies all three major Abrahamic scriptures. We're talking the Torah, the Gospel, and the Quran.
And it's not just a claim of, thematic similarity. The argument is much stronger.
Yeah.
It's about an identical architectural blueprint. The sources actually term it the spine of divine multi-presence.
The spine of divine multi-presence. Okay.
And the core idea is that this spine, this structure, it inherently resolves centuries of theological contradiction and conflict that seem to separate these faiths.
Right.
We're essentially looking for a common blueprint that was there along.
A common blueprint, and the core of that blueprint is, I have to say, it's challenging. It says God's identity is defined by this multi-presence.
Right.
Which means we're talking about a God who is not limited to one location or one mode or even one role at any given moment.
Exactly. And the most critical piece of this definition, the real anchor, is the principle of non-delegation.
Non-delegation.
The sources insist that the truly key divine actions, the ones that fundamentally define God's relationship with creation, things like ultimate judgment or ultimate redemption, are never, ever outsourced.
So he's not sending a proxy.
Never. They are executed by the divine identity itself simultaneously wherever necessary. The sources just keep repeating this one line. He comes himself.
Okay, let's unpack this with the essential vocabulary, because this entire deep dive seems to hinge on understanding two specific Hebrew words. We have to define the kind of oneness we're talking about. And the key term here is eshad.
Right. If you don't grasp the definition of eshad, the whole structure just sort of collapses. The sources are meticulously clear on this point. God's oneness, his unity, as it's defined in the foundational texts, is eshad.
Which means?
It denotes a unified composite oneness. It's a unity that explicitly allows for plurality within itself, but without any division.
So, if I'm tracking the sources correctly, this is the crucial moment. This is where we had to separate what we think of as traditional, maybe even simplified monotheism from this deeper structural concept. Echad is not the same as Yachad.
Precisely. That's the whole ball game right there. Yachid signifies solitary isolation, a singularity, absolute numerical one.
Like a single lonely sphere in space.
That's a great analogy, a lonely sphere.
Yeah.
And if the foundational text had defined God's oneness as Yachid, then multi-presence would be a flat-out contradiction. But they don't. They use Echad. Think of a symphony.
Okay.
One single work of music, right? But it has many notes, many different instruments, all working together in perfect harmony. Or the classic analogy you always hear is a bunch of grapes.
One cluster, but many individual grapes making it up.
One cluster, exactly.
Yeah.
So the structure allows for that kind of multiplicity within a unified will.
It's just fascinating how these massive theological arguments can hinge on a single word choice. It really makes you realize how many centuries of conflict might just stem from misinterpreting the difference between one cluster and one solitary object.
It changes everything. If we accept the premise that the original scriptural definition of oneness is echad, then this multi-present structure, it stops being a theological problem. It actually becomes, as the sources claim, the highest expression of unified monotheism. It defines God as being uniquely capable, not restricted.
Right. So the promised takeaway for you, the listener, is immediate clarity. Our mission here is to track this echad-based structure through the texts. And if this framework holds up, it's a powerhouse of a tool.
It really is.
Because the sources assert it immediately eliminates 10 competing theological theories. And these are theories that are all built on that other restrictive assumption of divine singularity of Yachid.
So we're moving from a state of, informational complexity where the Abrahamic texts all seem to be in conflict to a state of what the sources call profound coherence.
Okay, so to build this foundation, we have to start at the source code, the foundational grammar, which the texts place firmly in Genesis, specifically chapters 18 and 19.
Yes.
Now, most people, I think, read this as a story about Abraham's incredible hospitality or, the destruction of Sodom. But our sources are claiming it's actually a deliberate, detailed, divine primer on God's own identity structure.
It's the divine workshop. It's where God lays out the rules of his own identity for us to see. And the narrative setup in Genesis 18, verse 1, is just. It's absolutely critical. It begins by declaring unequivocally YHWH appeared to Abraham.
The divine name, singular, YHWH, the Lord.
Yes, the singular Lord is stated first. No ambiguity whatsoever.
But then the very next clause introduces this architectural tension, doesn't it? Because
Yeah.
immediately after it says YHWH appeared, the text describes that appearance as three men standing before him.
Exactly. And this isn't a clarification. It's not like, oh, by the way, there were also three men. This is the establishment of the rule. It is YHWH manifesting as three.
And the crucial part is Abraham's reaction.
Yes. When Abraham sees them, he doesn't greet them as gentlemen or my lords, plural.
Yeah.
He bows down and he addresses them collectively as one Lord Adonai.
And this is where that dynamic dialogue of the text comes into play. Because if this were just a story about, say, an initial divine appearance, and then he sent two separate angelic escorts, Abraham would have been corrected right then and there.
Right. You'd expect hey, Abraham, it's just me over here. These two are my assistants. But the sources highlight the profound silence of the text at this moment.
There's no correction.
No correction, no clarification, and certainly no downgrade. Abraham addresses the three as a unified identity, and the scripture accepts this unified identity. This is rule number one. Plurality within a unified identity is the accepted grammar of YHWH.
That sets the stage perfectly for this whole multi-presence model, but why this specific visitation? Why now? It's all leading to this ultimate act of regional judgment, Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right, and this moves us into the central pillar of the spine, non-delegation of judgment. In Genesis 18, verses 20 to 22, YHWH is absolutely emphatic about this. He says, I will go down myself and see.
Myself.
The sources stress that this is a deliberate theological statement. God isn't sending a subordinate agent, an angel, a prophet, to go investigate and then execute the judgment. He's confirming that this necessary divine action, the judgment of sin, requires his own direct presence.
And that's so important because it establishes a precedent, a rule for all later acts of divine action. If God doesn't delegate judgment,
Then it makes perfect sense that he wouldn't delegate redemption either, right?
Exactly.
It forms a single, consistent theological decision matrix. If the ultimate action demands the ultimate presence, then any later ultimate action like, say, purchasing humanity back, must also demand that same non-delegated presence.
Okay, so now let's look at how the multi-presence setup is actually executed right after this declaration. Genesis 18, verse 22, it notes that the men turn toward Sodom. Two of them go down.
While Abraham remains standing before YHWH.
See, this is the moment. This is where that restrictive Yashid model, the lonely sphere model, should be broken, but it isn't.
It isn't. If YHWH were strictly one person restricted to one place, he'd have to literally disappear from his conversation with Abraham to go to Sodom. Or you'd have to imagine two totally separate divine beings splitting off. But the text frames it so simply, it's just a simultaneous action.
So you have the unified divine identity, YHWH, acting in more than one location at the exact same time. YHWH is present with Abraham in this continuous, intense dialogue.
While YHWH is also physically going down to Sodom.
That is the definition of Echad in operational reality.
It is. One divine will, one divine name, capable of acting in separate locations without any fragmentation. The sources argue that this single mechanism, it resolves the later Trinitarian paradoxes centuries before they're even written down.
But let's play the skeptic here for a moment, because this is exactly where the angelic downgrading theory tries to step in and simplify everything. When the two arrive in Sodom, in Genesis 19, verse 1, they are called angels. In Hebrew, malach, messengers. So isn't that proof? Weren't they just, sidekicks?
This is a critical distinction that the sources spend a lot of time dismantling. And the assertion is that angel, or malach, is a role. It's a job description messenger. It's not a species. And it is definitely not an ontological demotion.
We have to remember the context.
We have to remember what was just said. YHWH already stated, I will go down myself. So if God is his own messenger, then the title malach simply describes the function that's required for this specific mission. It doesn't change the intrinsic identity of the one performing the function.
It's like if a CEO is flying to a big meeting and texts the agenda ahead to the board, the CEO is still the CEO, even though in that moment they were also acting as the messenger delivering the message.
That's a really helpful analogy. The identity that was established back in 18.1 YHWH, it persists through the role described in 19.1. The source argues the text does this deliberately. It's teaching us that God is fully capable of entering creation in a messenger role without for 1 second compromising his divine nature.
In this entire sequence, this whole divine primer, it culminates in the one verse that the sources call the definitive seal of the entire structure, Genesis 19.24.
This is the architectural linchpin. I mean, it's just impossible to read this verse without the multi-present spine in mind. The quote is so explicit. YHWH rained on Sodom and Gomorrah fire from YHWH out of the heavens.
It's self-referential grammar. It locks the identity in two distinct places at once.
Completely. You have YHWH on earth, the same one who appeared to Abraham, the one who went down to sea.
Calling down fire from YHWH, who's seated in the heavens.
And we have to note the location. Out of the Shemayim, that's the plural word for heavens. So let's just recap the structure it builds. One divine name, YHWH. Two locations, earth and the heavens, plural heavens, suggesting this immense scope. And one unified will, executing the judgment. This one verse is the Torah's definitive statement that God's oneness, his agad, is fully capable of simultaneous, multi-present action without any division or fragmentation.
It's the highest conceptual demonstration of monotheism.
That's what the sources argue.
The significance of that verse, you really can't overstate it, because if you take that grammar seriously, it preemptively debunks virtually every monotheistic argument that's based on divine limitation.
Exactly. It forces you, the learner, to confront the textual evidence first. Before any of the later theological systems were developed, whether we're talking rabbinic, Christian, or Islamic, the founding document of the covenant had already defined the divine identity as multi-present and non-delegated, and that is the critical foundation our sources provide.
Okay, so if the Genesis narrative provides the operational proof of multi-presence, the how, then the strength of this spine has to rely on later scriptures providing the what and the why. We need to see if this structure actually holds across the later texts.
That's the true test of coherence, isn't it? So we turn now to John, chapter 1. The sources argue this provides the metaphysical explanation for the mechanism that Genesis revealed. Genesis showed YHWH acting in multiplicity. John 1 explains the identity of that multiplicity.
The famous prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
The sources spend a significant amount of time on that Greek term, logos, the Word. It's defined not as some external creation or a secondary entity, but as the self-expression of the very same multi-present God we just saw in Genesis.
How do they explain that, the self-expression part?
Think of it like a thought. A thought is internal to the thinker. It is with the thinker. Yet the thought is also essentially the thinker themselves. It is the thinker, just expressed.
So how do the sources use that to distinguish this from, say, the Arian idea that the Son or the Word was a created being?
By focusing on that intrinsic, eternal relationship. The Word isn't something God produced externally at a specific moment in time. The text says the Word was God. It is the very form of God's self-manifestation.
So therefore,
the Word must be fully divine, uncreated, and not a separate God. So when John says later, the Word became flesh, the incarnation is framed as the ultimate act of multi-presence. It is God expressing himself, that self-manifestation, into creation.
not sending a proxy, not sending an external agent to stand in his place.
Never. It moves the concept of divine self-expression from a temporary appearance, like the three men in Genesis, to a fundamental, sustained aspect of the divine identity rooted in that Ekir principle we started with.
It's all connecting. So if Genesis showed that YHWH could be in two places at once, John explains that YHWH's internal expression, the Word, is the very mechanism by which that multi-presence functions.
Precisely. It gives it a name and a metaphysical reality.
Now, what's truly remarkable, according to these sources, is the claim that this consistency, this exact structure, is preserved perfectly using identical vocabulary within the Quran, a scripture that arose centuries later in a vastly different theological landscape.
This is where the cross-textual convergence becomes, well, pretty undeniable. The sources point directly to Quran, chapter 4, verse 171, which addresses Sisa, or Jesus. The text states that Isa is called Allah's word, Kalimatullah, and a spirit from him, Ruminhu.
Why is that specific phrasing, from him, so important?
Because of the preposition, Minu, from him. The sources argue this phrasing aligns perfectly with the unified multi-presence pattern we saw in Genesis and that John explained. If the word and spirit proceed from him, it maintains the internal, unified, non-external nature of the expression. It's not something made by him as an external object. It proceeds from him as an expression.
But wait a minute, let's push on that. Many mainstream interpretations would argue that spirit from him simply means a created spirit that God designated for a special purpose, similar to saying a building project from the engineer. How do the source stacks address that potential ambiguity?
They address it by focusing on the consistency of action. And this is key. If God defined himself back in Genesis as being non-delegated for ultimate actions, then the origin of the one who executes the ultimate act must be intrinsic, not created.
So the action defines the identity.
The action defines the necessary identity of the actor. If Esa, the Word, is responsible for the ultimate demonstration of God's presence and redemption, the sources argue the vocabulary must reflect that identity, not just a role. The term kalimatullah, the Word of God, it reinforces that John 1 premise that this is God's self-expression, not an outsourced creature.
This brings us right to the biggest theological flashpoint between the traditions, the crucifixion and the resurrection. Our sources claim that the Quran actually blocks the substitution theory, the idea that someone else was crucified instead of Jesus, by emphasizing God's non-delegated action, which perfectly mirrors the judgment principle in Genesis.
This is a really powerful rebuttal to that substitution variant. You have to look at Quran 19, verse 33. It's Asa speaking, and he says, "Peace be upon me the day I was born, and the day I die, and the day I shall be raised alive."
The day I die.
The sources interpret this as an explicit prophecy of both death and resurrection, which makes substitution logically impossible for the one speaking. You can't be substituted for if you're the one prophesying your own death.
And then there's the definitive act in Quran 4.158, where Allah addresses the event itself.
Yes. Allah states concerning Isa that he raised him to himself. The focus here is on the divine action. Allah raised him. Just as YHWH acted directly in two locations without replacement in Genesis 19.24, the Quran frames the event not as a cosmic swap or a trick,
but as a divine, non-delegated raising.
Directly into God's own presence. If judgment is non-delegated, resurrection is non-delegated. It confirms that the Word and Spirit, which proceed from him, are then raised to himself. The substitution theory requires delegation. It requires an external swap. The multi-present spine demands direct, non-delegated action, which is exactly what the texts confirm.
So let's look at the language of identity used to crown this whole structure. We have to return to the Hebrew scriptures for this, specifically Isaiah 44, verse 6.
This verse is the linguistic seal of the Echad structure. YHWH uses multiple supreme self-designations, reinforcing that one divine name can hold a plurality of roles without any fragmentation. YHWH declares, "I am the first, and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God."
A statement of absolute unity.
Yes, but within that claim of singularity, he's called both King and Redeemer.
And the sources really emphasize that Redeemer title here, right?
Absolutely. Redeemer implies action, specifically the ultimate action of purchase or salvation. By naming himself as the King and the Redeemer, the unified identity demands that any subsequent act of redemption must be executed by that same divine identity.
The identity is unified despite the plurality of the descriptions and roles.
Exactly. This is the language of multi-presence, but applied to titles. And it perfectly sets up the necessary identity for the later manifestation of the Word made flesh. The Redeemer must be YHWH.
And finally, we just have to circle back to the absolute core of monotheism, the Shema in Deuteronomy 6.4. The sources say this is the ultimate proof that the spine is rooted in the very definition of oneness.
It is. The Shema declares YHWH is Ashid. We just cannot overstate this. If the intent of the foundational covenant was to establish a deity of solitary isolation, the text had the perfect word available, Yekid.
But it didn't use it.
It explicitly chose Akkad unified oneness, the potential for composite unity. So the source argues the Shema doesn't erase the multi-presence we saw demonstrated in Genesis 18 and 19. It validates it, it confirms the structure, a oneness that is capable of internal self-expression and simultaneous non-delegated action. The complexity of Genesis is upheld by the specific vocabulary of the Shema.
So the foundation is solid. Genesis shows the mechanism.
Sean explains the metaphysics.
The Quran confirms the vocabulary and the non-delegated action.
And Isaiah names the roles.
Now comes the stress test.
The stress test.
Okay, let's run it. If this spine of divine multi-presence really represents the consistent grammar across these independent texts, then its real utility lies in its destructive power against competing theories.
Right.
So we're going to examine 10 variant theological frameworks that are built on assumptions of divine limitation assumptions that Genesis 19.24 and the definition of Echad should instantly overturn.
This section is the analytical powerhouse of the sources, really, because each of these 10 theories relies on restricting God to one person, one location, or one time. Or they assume that delegation is possible for the ultimate divine acts.
And the multi-present spine says that restriction is unnecessary and, more importantly, textually unfounded.
Exactly.
So let's start with the first variant, one we've already touched on, but it needs to be fully dissected. The Islamic substitution theory. This is the claim that God swapped Jesus with someone else on the cross, often citing, some vague textual support or later interpretations.
This collapses immediately because the spine asserts that multi-presence replaces substitution. God doesn't need a body double. The whole concept is a workaround for a problem that doesn't exist if God is multi-present.
And the textual rebuttal is just so direct.
It is. Quran 19.33, I will die and be raised. And then 4.158, Allah raised him to himself. If God is capable of acting in two locations simultaneously, YHWH from YHWH, and if God is non-delegating for the ultimate act of purchase, then the very mechanism of substitution is redundant. It's contradictory to God's defined nature. The raising is an act of direct, unified identity, not an external exchange.
Okay, moving to the second variant, the mere prophet theory.
This one reduces Jesus, or Isa, to only a human messenger. A great one, for sure, but still just a human. This fails because of two core principles of the spine: non-delegation and the specific vocabulary of identity. God does not send his word and spirit as something other than himself when he's performing the ultimate divine task of redemption.
And the proof texts for that are?
You rely on Quran 4.171, which calls him the word and spirit from God. You have John 1, where the word is God. And you have Isaiah 44.6, which states that YHWH is the Redeemer.
So if redemption is a non-delegated divine act,
then the actor must possess the non-delegated divine identity. To call him only human contradicts both the defined source of his being, word and spirit from him, and the defined role he came to fulfill, Redeemer. It just doesn't compute.
All right, the third variant, Unitarian isolationism. This is the argument that true monotheism demands God be one person, restricted to a single location. It's a very restrictive, very spatial concept of God.
The entire narrative of Genesis 18 and 19 is the instant counterproof to this. This theory is trying to impose Yachid, that solitary isolation, onto God, but the Shema itself rejects it by using Ajir. The texts explicitly show YHWH present on earth and calling down fire from YHWH in the heavens. The spine demonstrates that Yachid, this unified capacity for multi-presence, is the reality of God's oneness. It completely destroys the isolationist restriction.
Variant number 4, Arianism, the created son theory. This sees the Word, or the Son, as a created being, a very special one, the first and greatest creation, but still a created being.
This fails because of that foundational concept of self-expression. God does not create his own self-expression any more than you create your own thoughts. They are intrinsic to you.
So if the Word were created,
it would be an external agent. And that violates the non-delegation principle. John 1.1, the Word was God, directly refutes this. The Quran's phrasing in 4.171, defining the Word and Spirit as from him, implies an intrinsic origin, not an external creation event. Again, Isaiah 44.6. The Redeemer must be YHWH. The Word, acting as Redeemer, therefore cannot be a created being if the act is truly non-delegated.
Okay, the fifth variant is modalism. Can you just explain that one briefly for our listeners?
Sure. Modalism suggests that God merely appears in different masks or roles. Sometimes he's the Father, then he puts on the Son mask, then he puts on the Spirit mask. But he's never simultaneously present in these modes. It's sequential role-playing.
And how does the spine immediately refute that specific sequential definition?
Because the spine is built on simultaneous action, not sequential. Genesis 18 and 19 show God present with Abraham while simultaneously going to Sodom. Modalism demands a singularity of presence. Multi-presence confirms the duality of simultaneous presence, all while maintaining that single unified identity of YHWH.
And Genesis 19.24.
That's the ultimate refutation. The action from YHWH to YHWH is simultaneous. It's not YHWH changing hats one at a time. God is genuinely multi-present.
Next up, variant 6, angelic downgrading. This is the attempt to simplify Genesis 18 and 19 by claiming the two figures who visited Sodom were just angels.
It's a tempting simplification, but it fails because it directly contradicts God's spoken intent in the text. YHWH said, I will go down myself. The sources are firm on this. Angel is a role, a descriptive title for a messenger function. It is not a demotion of identity.
God is his own messenger.
He is, and the text confirms this divine capacity to take on a servant or messenger role without ever ceasing to be YHWH. The identity established in 18.1 persists because the ultimate action judgment demands the presence of YHWH.
Okay, variant 7, delegated redemption. This is massive because it challenges the entire mechanism of salvation in some traditions. It's the idea that God delegates the ultimate act of saving or purchasing or atoning for humanity to some subordinate being.
This is a direct, fundamental contradiction of the entire non-delegation spine. If judgment requires YHWH's direct presence, as we saw in Genesis 18, then the flip side of that coin, redemption, the ultimate purchase, must also require it.
And Isaiah 44.6 locks that in.
It explicitly calls YHWH the Redeemer. John 1 shows God becoming flesh to execute this non-delegated act. If you outsource salvation, you fragment the core identity of YHWH as both King and Redeemer. It's like a CEO hiring an intern to sign the biggest acquisition deal in the company's history. It violates the fundamental principle of who is authorized to perform the ultimate act.
Let's look at the internal critiques from within the traditions. Variant 8, Jewish anti-multiplicity polemics. This is the argument that any idea of plurality within the divine is a later foreign contamination that violates true Jewish monotheism.
The sources argue this polemic collapses because the internal grammar of the Torah itself shows the plurality within unity. Genesis 19.24 is the smoking gun YHWH from YHWH. This polemic mistakenly assumes God's oneness must be Yeshid when the Shema itself confirms it's a Keshed.
And the historical argument.
The crucial argument here is historical. These polemics often arose from a later and perhaps necessary simplification of monotheism that happened after the foundation was laid. But it's a simplification that overlooks the complex, explicit grammar contained right there in Genesis 18 and 19. The foundation predates the simplification.
And the 9th variant mirrors that, but from within Islam, Muslim anti-divinity polemics. The argument that calling Jesus divine violates Tawhid, the absolute, indivisible unity of God.
This collapse is solved with what the sources call Tawhid with vocabulary. The Quran itself provides the very vocabulary for a non-external expression. Hathi is defined as Allah's word and spirit from him. The spine maintains absolute unity, Tawhid, by defining the word and spirit not as independent, separate entities, but as internal expressions of the one God's multi-presence.
It maintains unity while allowing for self-expression.
Exactly. It aligns perfectly with Genesis 19.24's structural proof and John 1's metaphysics. The concept is that only God can fully express God. This isn't a violation of unity, it's the ultimate expression of it.
And finally, the 10th variant, which kind of encompasses all the others. Secular reductionism. The idea that all of this is just contradictory myth patched together by different cultures over time and that it lacks any internal sophisticated coherence.
This fails on the grounds of cross-textual consistency. The multi-presence spine model doesn't just paper over contradictions. It solves them by appealing to a consistent underlying grammar that runs across these independent scriptures. The fact that the Torah, the Gospel, and the Quran, separated by centuries, by culture, by context, all converge on the identical structure.
Non-delegated divine action.
Unified identity, internal expression with the Word and Spirit. All of it is argued to be statistically improbable for random mythology. The internal coherence itself is the primary evidence against reductionism.
So the power of this analysis is that it's not really introducing new concepts. It's just forcing us to read the foundational texts with the most rigorous definition of their own stated grammar.
It shifts the entire conversation. If you remove the assumptions of restriction and delegation, these texts stop fighting each other. They actually start cohering around a single, unified, and deeply complex divine identity.
The systematic destruction of those 10 frameworks, it leaves us, the learner, with only one structurally viable theological model left standing. The logic feels, well, unavoidable.
The central line of logic holds incredibly firm. God does not delegate redemption. He doesn't outsource judgment. He doesn't substitute himself away. He comes himself. The sources argue this single principle defines the entire narrative of divine interaction, from the founding of the covenant to the ultimate act of purchase and raising.
So let's just synthesize that unified narrative of divine action. Let's see how it flows across the history documented in these sources, tracking this direct, multi-present engagement.
Okay, it starts in the Torah, where we see YHWH's direct presence in judgment. The fire fell from YHWH to YHWH, and the rescue from Egypt, too, was executed by the one unified, multi-present God.
Then we move to the gospel context.
And the Word became flesh. This is God's self-expression entering creation directly. And in the final act, that non-delegated action of resurrection is confirmed. The Spirit raised him to God, Golgotha was the purchase,
Mhm.
and it was executed by the Redeemer.
Who Isaiah 44.6 already confirmed is YHWH himself.
It's all one continuous direct action.
It really is a beautifully consistent theological arc when you view it through the lens of echad and non-delegation. So if we strip away all the subsequent theological assumptions, what are the final 5 core elements of the structure that remains, the spine itself?
Okay, the architecture that's proven by the texts boils down to these 5 points. 1, one God, but defined by echad, that unified oneness.
2,
2, plural heavens, the Shamim, indicating the immense scope of divine presence. 3,
Yeah.
multiple presence, meaning simultaneous action in different locations.
Mm.
4, one will, which ensures there's no division or conflict between the presences. And 5, Word, Spirit, Redeemer, which are understood as the internal self-expressions and the non-delegated roles of that single unified identity.
and the final synthesis of the texts. How do the key scriptures lock into the spine?
They function like parts of a coherent user manual. Each one offers necessary context that validates the others.
So Genesis?
Genesis shows it. It establishes the operational grammar of multi-presence with YHWH from YHWH.
Yes.
John explains it. He provides the metaphysical vocabulary for the mechanism. The Word was God.
The Quran.
The Quran preserves it
Right.
by utilizing that precise language of internal expression, Word and Spirit from him, and confirming the non-delegated resurrection to himself.
And Isaiah.
Isaiah names it. He confirms the unified roles required for divine action, King and Redeemer.
This moves the whole discussion of divine identity across the Abrahamic traditions, from an argument over what seem like irreconcilable contradictions to a conversation about profound, intricate convergence.
Indeed. And for you, the listener, this structure offers a rigorous, consistent tool. It allows you to interpret these scriptures not as isolated, conflicting documents, but as converging accounts of a single, highly sophisticated model of divine identity and action.
It offers immediate clarity.
It does, by cutting away centuries of theological debate that were, in many cases, built on a fundamental misunderstanding of the definition of God's oneness, assuming Yachid when the text itself demanded Ishad.
So what does this all mean? The spine of divine multi-presence. It forces us to completely rethink what unity means. It's not isolation, it's a dynamic, active, perfect unity capable of simultaneously expressing and executing all ultimate actions across all dimensions.
It defines God by capacity, not by restriction. And that leads us to the final, provocative thought to mull over. If we accept the analysis of these sources, we are left with this question. When Scripture is separated by vast centuries, by different cultures, by completely different theological traditions, when they independently arrive at the identical structure of divine identity, action, and internal vocabulary, how does one account for that coherence? Did they all simply stumble upon the same incredibly complex mythological structure by chance? Or does the consistency itself suggest a single foundational architecture that was perhaps later obscured by attempts to simplify the profound complexity of the unified divine identity? That challenge to our established assumptions that focus on original, sophisticated coherence, that is the true deep dive this material provides.